So today we are living, much more longer and more prosperous lives than we've ever done before. And as a species, we've made, huge advances to create conditions for better health for billions of people. But I guess the question of this talk really is at what cost to our environment and our ultimate long-term health and well-being. And that's what I'm trying to address here in the talk today, in my plenary. And I'm going to explore those links and interdependencies between our health and the health of our planet, with particular reference to infectious diseases. So, and ones like Ebola and COVID, for example. So I want to try to explore how we can use this knowledge of these links to get a better understanding of disease risk, and perhaps use that understanding to forecast, use models to forecast risk, and to really start to think about how to prevent new pandemics and new outbreaks happening. So I'm starting with a picture of from Freetown in Sierra Leone, and this was taken not long after the Ebola outbreak in 2014. And I just wanted to kind of remind you that although, our lives have been completely disrupted and shaped by COVID, that these kinds of diseases have been shaping societies for millions of years, and how important infectious diseases are in our society. Okay, so I'm going to start with some background to, the state of the planet as it is at the moment, and some of the known environmental links to health. And then just thinking a bit more about the evidence for environmental links to infectious diseases, because that's not as clear cut as you might imagine. And then if we can kind of pin down these links, maybe we can then operationalize it. And I'm going to kind of give some examples from my own work where we've been creating statistical and mathematical models in order to kind of operationalize our knowledge and then forecast future outbreaks and hopefully prevent some things happening again. So I'm going to give some examples from Lassa Fever and Ebola, which are really important diseases, and then have a think about other diseases and future prospects just to end. Okay, so let's just start with this overview then of the state of the planet. So as you know, there are around 7 billion people on this planet at the moment, and that's growing. But this is a graph from Our World in Data. So this is just looking at human population growth and the amount of humans in the human population growth in the purple line. So number of humans is in green, and then it kind of stops around now. So, and then we've got the lighter green in, that's kind of future projections. So the first thing to know is that human populations have been pretty stable for most of our evolutionary history, and it's only in the late 1900s that this changed, and the kind of period of time this is called, and this kind of massive acceleration in the growth rate, is called the Great Acceleration. And so human populations have really skyrocketed and only kind of tipped out around 1970s, 1980s, and then is and will be declining. So human populations were kind of kept in check before this great acceleration by high child mortality. And now it's kind of more about female choice, about choosing to have smaller families, or having enough money or having enough education to make those choices. So we think that the human populations will level out around the end of the century, so 2100, at around 11 billion, and then start to either level off or decline. So that's the kind of background to this. And of course, the human population is not spread homogeneously across the planet, and there are certain areas which have got more than others. I'm giving you this background because it means that we've undergone some really, really, really serious changes in our society and our socioeconomics. And when I said that we're living more prosperous lives, healthier lives than ever before, that's really true. And no matter what the latest doom thing is on the news, we are in this kind of period of low poverty, or the poverty has decreased sharply, so that the average per capita GDP has increased, but also our kind of health and well-being has increased, but that this has come at some kind of cost to other societal socioeconomic changes. So the amount of CO2 that we're pumping out, the amount of fertilizer, the amount of land that we're using for crops is going down per capita, because we're using so much of the planet for agriculture. So this is then also reflected in our health. So all cases of human disease are declining, and this is really amazing story. Like human disease has crashed really. You think about it now with all the news, but in general we've had a really big success story. So so all cases are declining, but things like malaria, diarrheal disease, which is a kind of a poverty related disease, and also kind of people being malnourished and starving, is also declining. So these are really good signs. But there is trouble in paradise, as you probably know. So not all diseases are declining, and some of them are increasing. So these data are all from the WHO Global Burden of Disease in 2015, and the latest figures might be slightly changed. But you've got increases in some of these diseases. So heat and cold exposure, dengue fever, skin cancer, forces of nature, which is, I think, an awesome way to go, really. If I'm going to go, I think I'd like to go that way. So there are a mixed picture, really. So overall cases of disease are declining. So we are healthier and more prosperous than we ever have been before in our history. But there are some signs that that's not true. That's not true for some things. And those kind of warning signs have been picked up by the public health community. And this is a really powerful body, public health community and international community, and they control a large amount of budget and control a lot of international policies. And they are a very important group of people in academic circles and policy circles. And I think it was a really amazing turn of events that they kind of woke up in 2015, a little bit earlier, and started to really see these warning signs for these different diseases that were going up, and made that really big link to the environment. And I think this is a really big kind of milestone for the public health community to look beyond just proximate causes of disease and really think about the ultimate causes of disease, and thinking about how the environment is really, really linked to our health and well-being. So this is a climate report that came out, and the Lancet countdown for climate change, for health and climate change, is ongoing now. And this is a really important body which is looking at the evidence for links between climate change and health. And those are, an easier sell perhaps than many of the other links, but these are things like, heat related deaths, but also pollution, which is exacerbated by temperature. And, I think that the public health community have really latched on to the idea of climate change being a really big pressing concern for human health. But, it's not as simple as that. And that's just one element of the environment. And we're disrupting the Earth's systems so profoundly that it's not just about climate change, it's also about ecosystems and how we're changing ecosystems. So ecosystems are just habitats with species and how they all interact, and that's an ecosystem. So we're fundamentally changing those things. And I think that the links between changing ecosystems and public health are much more nuanced and have been kind of missed in this kind of focus on climate change. By the way, the infographics by by Ed Hawkins, and he's amazing. And so you should have a look at some of his infographics about climate change and temperature change across the 150 years or so. But he's got some great graphics, so go and have a look at him on Twitter and his websites. Okay, so we're disrupting ecosystems, and this has had a profound effect on the biodiversity and the amount of habitats which are on the planet now, and causing a lot of these species to go extinct and predicted to go extinct in the next 50 years or so. And one of the main factors is habitat destruction, but also exploitation and climate change. So I just put some of the drivers on the right here, so it's not exhaustive, but it's kind of the amount of people, but that kind of translates to chopping down and converting land into other anthropogenic uses, but also fragmenting landscapes by building roads. So, you know, there's a huge network of roads on the planet which are, you know, cutting up the available habitats for natural ecosystems and biodiversity and wildlife. And of course, global temperature change, we've only seen a kind of 1.25, 1.2, 1.3 rise in global temperatures, but the number of extreme events which is now happening is increasing. And so this will probably kick into have much more of effect on species as we go through. So we're disrupting natural ecosystems. Does it matter? I think that's a really good question. And this is a kind of schematic from an assessment done for the UK in 2011. So this is a kind of national ecosystems assessment where looked at all of the ecosystems in the UK and to see what kind of state they were in, and thought about how these were kind of connected up to our health and well-being. So the idea really here is that you've got all of biodiversity in the green box, all of life on Earth and everything in the green box. And then you've got some kind of, these species are put into ecosystems, and these ecosystems have some kind of benefit to us, some ecosystem service which is being produced, and which then is kind of translating into some good. So this is a very anthropogenic centric view of the world. So all of nature is for us here in this diagram. But then these goods are then translated into something like into our health and well-being. And then any kind of environmental change and like climate change or land use change impacts the green box, which then impacts the ecosystem services, the goods provided, and our health and well-being. So examples are in the kind of the round circle there, but that could be kind of pollination for crops, and then food security, and then health and well-being and food security being part of that in the kind of dark purple box on the left-hand side. So this kind of figure is kind of starting to be, these kinds of links are starting to be appreciated at a wider view, not just ecologists and people who think about ecosystems and ecosystem services and biodiversity and wildlife. So this is starting to get more traction now. And I think the kind of links that we're talking about here are a bit more nuanced than heat and cold causes of mortality and morbidity, but they are more nuanced, but actually I think really important. And I think that the public health community is starting to understand that our dependence on ecosystems and the goods and services that are being provided is really critical. So I'm putting this slide up from the World Economic Forum. So this is just to kind of show you that it's not just wildlife people or ecologists or biodiversity people that are starting to think this. But these are, you know, World Economic Forum gather every year at Davos in their, you know, drinking champagne, being, you know, on their private jets. These are like international leaders, these are business leaders, these are policymakers around the world. They are, you know, really worried about this and have seen this kind of how important how critically we are dependent on ecosystems. And you can kind of see a growing worry across a number of years. So every year they kind of think about the top risks to the top kind of risks that the world sees every year. And I think they've realized that, or a growing recognition that environmental risks are really important, really underpinning our societies. And you can see it from the early 2010s, so this increasing recognition of how important these are. So it's unknown whether they're actually more important now, or they just really understood that and then recognize that they are. So I would probably think the latter. But I think what's interesting here is that, these are being also reflected in global reports like the IPCC and another kind of sister body to the IPCC, which is called IPBES, which is the International Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So these ideas and these worries are being felt by these international bodies as well, and also by the Sustainable Development Goals. And it has life on land and life on sea, in the sea and water, as some critical kind of goals for the SDGs. So I think this is increasingly being recognized as important. And I think it's just trying to figure out how we operationalize those links between environmental change and health. I think that's the key issue here. And I think that's what my research has been trying to do, is trying to think about, well, how do we use this knowledge to then think about what the risks are going forwards? So I just want to point out at the bottom of the slide is the kind of the global risks that the World Economic Forum highlighted for this year in 2021. And infectious disease rose to prominence, obviously, because of the COVID pandemic. And I found that was really interesting, because I'm going to argue that I think it should also be green, because it's an environmental problem. And so these are the headlines which were being reflected early in the beginning of the pandemic in March last year. And there was a huge number of reports and headlines about how, nature, it was because of our destruction of nature that was responsible for the pandemic. And I found that really interesting, because, I think that too, but I think it had kind of raised its profile into the public in a huge way. And I think that, understanding how destruction of nature how could it possibly impact the COVID-19 pandemic, and trying to unpick that and understand that, I think, is really critical. So if you just stop and think about it for a minute, I've just told you that we're disrupting ecosystems at a huge rate, and things are going extinct and populations are crashing. So if we have, if a large amount of our diseases are from animals and there are fewer of them, then shouldn't we be expecting fewer diseases, not more? So why are we having more diseases? How can this possibly be true? How can COVID be, related to destruction of nature? So I'm just going to maybe explore that, because it's actually quite interesting, and it led me to think about this in a new way. And it means that we can start to really think about how to make this into a predictive framework. So I'm just going to explore this issue a little bit more. So as I just said, the majority of infectious diseases are from animals, and they're called zoonotic ones. They have an animal origin. And this is a kind of survey I did as a young postdoc in 2008. That was a long time ago, and published this paper to look at the first time, what the characteristics were of infectious diseases that have merged into human populations. And these kinds of diseases are transmitted through lots and lots of different ways. So it could be fecal oral, it could be directly through the air, through droplets, it could be through bodily fluids. So there's lots of ways of how these pathogens come from animals into people. And also they could be vector-borne, so they could have a cycle with an animal, a non-human animal, within an insect, possibly an arthropod vector into humans, or it could be direct. or it could just cycle within the vector and the human. So there's lots and lots of ways that this could happen. But majority of those, the infectious diseases we get are from either directly from animals or they're borne by animals. And our best evidence really suggests that these kind of transfers are increasing over time, not decreasing. So you would expect, because we've trashed the planet, that we'd have fewer, but actually the evidence is suggesting that we have more. And that I did this paper in 2008, so that's why there's an apparent drop off there, but other papers subsequently have shown that this is increasing. Okay, so when we start to think about why this is happening, one of the early papers by Peter Daszak in 2000 really started to think about these emerging infectious diseases and how they were shared between not just wildlife and animals, but domestic animals and then people, and then thinking about how these pathogens, these infectious agents, a transfer between animals and people when something changes. So when this transmission pathway changes, that's when you get these problems occurring, these pathogens jumping into human populations. So all species have, pathogens. That all species have microbes. All species have things which can jump into other species. So it's just that when the environment changes, that's when infectious diseases seem to be emerging. And that was really in 2000 when this was the kind of first idea of trying to figure out what could those things be. So it could be that you're encroaching into a wildlife area. So human encroachment would expose you to novel diseases. It could be that once the disease has emerged into a human population, that global travel and urbanization might mean that you can spread it really quickly, or domestic species could be, the pathogen could be spreading in domestic species because of agricultural intensification or something like that. So we started to think about what these big drivers could be. And then in 2008, I published this paper with Peter to think about, could we start to make this more predictive? So we looked at, this is a simple spatial model, global spatial model, where we looked at where the first time that any new diseases emerged. And then we looked at other kind of socio-ecological factors which might promote this emergence. And so one of the outputs from this was that, we found a correlation between areas of high population density of humans, but also of kind of biodiversity, species richness. So it seemed like where there was lots of wildlife and lots of novel pathogens, that's where you got these spillovers happening. And this led to the first kind of predictive models, simple predictive models of infectious diseases hotspots. And this led to a lot of funding from USAID to go and survey some of these hotspot areas where we thought there was a potential for the next pandemic, the next spillover to occur. However, so that was a model of kind of amplification. So where there was a high kind of species richness of animals and there was loads of humans, there's kind of biodiversity here was acting as an amplifier for spillover. However, and I was on both of these papers, so it was kind of the opposite side of the point. There was a lot of kind of research into the protective effect of biodiversity. So this idea was, and the poster child for this idea is Lyme disease. And this idea is where you have areas which have got high biodiversity, so lots and lots of species, which kind of dilute the pathogen spreading between species. So they spread between species, but because there's so many of them, you don't get that spillover into humans, or that they have not a higher risk of spilling over to humans because there are more species present. So I never really bought this idea particularly, but I didn't understand why fewer species would mean that you would have a higher chance of getting a spillover into humans. But the kind of Lyme disease model was quite interesting in that you had, say, an intact community, and you have white-footed mice and possums and lots of other things in that community. And then when you destroy it or degrade it, all you get is white-footed mice. So there's lower biodiversity. And then white-footed mice are just really brilliant at spreading Lyme disease, which is being a vector from the tick. So it's really bad at grooming ticks off. And so it kind of ends up spreading these diseases, and there's lots of them, and you come into contact with them, you get Lyme disease. So I was kind of struggling with this and how you could then take that into a kind of more operationalized or advisable model. And I think it's not really diversity per se, but exactly how each species responds to environmental change, I think was really important. And I think that over the years, there's been more work on dilution effect, showing that it is a bit more general than just one disease. But then there was a lot more work on a focus on the host. And I think I'm just going to explain just a couple of kind of papers which I think are really important to kind of pull this story together. So in when the pandemic happened, there was a really big focus on hosts, and that bats might be the kind of source of this virus. And I think that kind of reflects this kind of, a real big focus on or a really big interest now in the host. Can we understand a bit more about the host and how they're reacting to change? So, that was kind of the start of it. And I think bats are really super interesting. I love bats, so I'm really biased, but I think they're super interesting. And I think that led to quite a lot of publicity about bats and how, are they really evil? Are they like these massive mass spreaders of diseases? Do they have all these viruses which are just going to come into us? So there was a recent paper in 2020 which kind of explored this idea to show that, yes, they do have a lot of viruses which can come into the human population, but there's a lot of bats, so they don't have more in proportion to other groups of mammals. So I think that was quite an interesting one that kind of, diffused some of the kind of ire that bats were facing because of this. And then I think there is a kind of caveat to this, though, that there is something really interesting about bats in that they have adapted their metabolisms for the evolution of flight. And flight is very energetically expensive and creates these free radicals, which causes DNA damage. And that kind of mimics the damage that a virus does when it's inside a body and an individual. And so bats have evolved to kind of deal with intracellular pathogens really, really well. So they kind of have immune systems which are always switched on. So actually they may be special hosts of viruses after all, because these viruses have to survive in these very, hostile environments, and then when they get into another organism, they may cause damage. But I think what kind of joins this all together is like how different species respond to change. So what this graph is just showing you how abundance is changing across human pressure gradients. So different species respond positively. Some rats, some bats respond positively to human pressures. And I think it's trying to understand how these populations change across these gradients. That's really interesting. And I think that is the kind of key to understanding. So it's kind of something about their life history, but also about how they respond to change, and that makes them better hosts or not better hosts. So Matt kind of really tries to get to what is the role of the host and global change and environmental change in then increasing or decreasing the risk of spillover. So we try to look at this globally across lots and lots of studies last year. So we published this last year in August in 2020. So this is just with some of my postdocs and PhD students. So we looked at a kind of massive meta-analysis where we looked at how across land use gradients, what what happens to you know, communities of animals? How do they go down? The numbers of species go down or they go up? Which species are impacted? And are those species which are responding positively or negatively to these changes, are they more likely or less likely to be hosts of pathogens which can make us sick? So we showed, so this was a kind of mixed effects model where we're looking at a you know, gradient across a gradient in a study, and then we've put these studies all together so that we're trying to look at locally, but then you know, scale up globally so we can make these larger generalizations. So what we found is that, you know, overall species which are more likely to be hosts of pathogens that spread pathogens to us react in this positive way to degraded landscapes. So that could be something about how, you know, their life history is different. They invest less in immunity. They can survive in these degraded landscapes. But it seems like we're creating these landscapes which are not healthy for us, because the population and communities change, and they change in such a way that they have species which are hosting these pathogens. And I think that's a really interesting result, which kind of pulls together some of the early studies and shows a kind of a way to kind of generalize this and then make some forecasts about how global change might impact these communities. And so we looked just at different taxa as well, and we could see that it kind of holds within some taxa, and some taxa are actually much better at hosting, react much more positively to degraded landscapes, and some of these tend to be the ones which then spread diseases into us. So like passerine birds and bats and rats are kind of some of the culprits here. So it kind of gives a kind of mechanism for what is actually happening. We're degrading landscapes, species are trying to survive in their life histories are such that they're investing less in immunity, and then we have, you know, we're creating these landscapes, and then we have these spillovers. So where does this all lead us? Well, I said we wanted to use this as a framework to kind of make predictions. And so we kind of came up with this idea of using a kind of hazard exposure vulnerability model, a HEV model, to understand risk. And often when we've been, you know, the global health community looks at diseases, they don't tend to take this kind of multidisciplinary approach. And we've been trying to think about the importance of the host, and we've just shown you how communities change as you degrade them in terms of climate change and land use change. And then you have to put that on top of exposure, so human livelihoods. And then you have to think about the vulnerability of those populations. And then in the end, that comes up to risk. So that's how we've tried to think about how we model risk. So the next few bits are just some examples of how we've gone about doing this for particular diseases using this kind of framework. So the first kind of diseases we looked at was part of this dynamic drivers disease consortium that we put together a couple of years ago, and we looked at the disease Lassa Fever. So Lassa Fever is a hemorrhagic disease like Ebola, and it just has a less mortality, but quite a high morbidity in number of cases across Africa. West Africa is quite extraordinary. So this has got a restricted distribution puzzle, because the cases are in West Africa, but the distribution of the host, which is an agricultural pest and reacts positively to land use change, is all over sub-Saharan Africa. So that's quite an interesting juxtaposition. Like, why is Lassa Fever just in West Africa? So we did some studies to look at their gene sequences across sub-Saharan Africa, and it turns out there are at least 3 different groups. So they may be subspecies or different species, but the virus has probably evolved separately in this West African clade. And so, you know, this just illustrates the importance of understanding that hazard piece. So we started to think about modeling this. We used machine learning to understand the cases of Lassa fever, and then try to match that up to environmental layers, and then to think about predicting into places where we didn't have samples to understand the risk landscape of Lassa fever. So we started doing this with the case data that we had, and showed a really big influence of the kind of the risk surface of the suitability of the host, which you would expect, given that it's the host for the disease. But this was a really, this didn't feel very satisfying, because our Lassa cases are completely biased and not recorded properly. So we tried to kind of do a new kind of type of modelling, where we thought about how epidemiological modelling is done when we try to think about how pathogens are spread between human populations. And this was a really kind of a mashup model between epidemiology, but also this correlative machine learning. So we cut up the world into little grid squares, and we had these mechanistic models running, and then had people moving around these models. So we had some spillover constants in there, so that we parameterized it with real data to then think about how we could then make from first principles these predictions. And actually these kind of hotspot maps are much more closer to what we think is the cases of Lassa fever when it's been intensively studied in Nigeria, for example, on the right-hand side. So this was a kind of new way of going from first principles and thinking about how to put all of this kind of framework together. And we've kind of expanded that now to thinking about working with this NCDC in Nigeria, who've started up this amazing surveillance program, and taking this type of approach to then start to think about forecasting in time as well as space. So we have some new models which will, because they're linked to the climate and the host distributions, we can forecast 3 months ahead because it's linked to the rainfall patterns. Okay, so just briefly then, we kind of then started to think about another problem, which is Ebola. And unlike the Lassa fever that only goes from animals to people, Ebola goes from people to people as well. So we had to think about how to build up another kind of framework, or add on to the framework that we were doing. So we kind of came up with this modelling framework where we didn't just have spillover, but we also had the virus kind of spreading across human populations, so that you have a susceptible to exposed model there, where you've got the animals transmitting pathogens, but then also you've got the pathogen transmitting across the human populations, and between grid squares, exposed and infectious people could travel. So this is really fun, because you could start to then play with the model to then think about different scenarios of future global change. So you could start to think about, well, what's the present model, and what's the present prediction, and then what's the future one under different kind of land use changes. And this is really important for Ebola, because we've only had, say, 20 or so outbreaks. And so modeling it across with a kind of machine learned model would be very difficult and produce a lot of error. You'd just be modeling error, really. So I think just briefly then, we came up from first principles without using any of the location data where we thought these cases might be. And not just about, where the cases were, but where the kind of biggest epidemics might be in this kind of simulation framework that we built, which was running over many simulations across, starting points, and then letting it run across the servers at UCL. So we were trying to kind of create these runs to then produce these probability surfaces. So interestingly, and this is just anecdotal, but I just want to put it up, we were finding that the Ebola outbreak in Congo that happened in 2018 just happened in the places where we felt like, from our simulations, these are the areas which are at higher risk, which produce more than 1,500 cases in our simulations. So it's kind of an interesting tool where you can start to explore things. So we can try different scenarios of climate change, but also shared societal pathways, which are ways to then think about how the socioeconomic framing and conditions will change across the planet, and the different, certain assumptions about global change and societal pressures. So I think that's really interesting, and you can try to put in vulnerability as well. So for example, if you put in a new vaccination program, what would that do? So we just did some thought experiments in this paper, just thinking about what would happen under different kind of climate change and socioeconomic futures under different scenarios, which was, I don't think I want you to take those too seriously, but just the idea that we can start to make this framing. So back to this kind of HEV model, this kind of systems dynamic model, I think this is a really powerful tool to start to understand risk, and having the kind of hazard, which is our interactions with animals and how land use and climate change those interactions, is critical for understanding future risk. So I've just to end then, we just got some money from the Trinity Challenge to try to build, and building on the amazing stuff that they're doing there in terms of surveillance. We've been working with different partners there across West Africa to start to use the data that they're getting in these surveillance programs to then turn them into these forecasting frameworks and forecasting models. Okay, just to end then, I really think that we need to take the systems dynamic approach to forecasting diseases and understanding how global change impacts diseases. We need a much more nuanced approach and understanding of how hosts and vectors are responding to global change, because that's key to understanding what our risks are and how we can stop those. And I think there are really cool new methodological, new data and new methodologies that are really helping us to get to some of these questions and answers, like this kind of coupled temporal and spatial models, putting more mechanisms into these correlative models, making it these at huge scales across landscapes. But we do need more of this interdisciplinary thinking across medicine, ecology, computer science in order to be able to do this properly. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Kate, for this very interesting talk on a very important topic. And I will just start getting into the questions. I have a lot of questions myself, but I'll let the audience go first. So here's the first question. Early in the talk, you showed us that some diseases increase in frequency, like melanoma, you showed, and other diseases. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been the controversy about whether rising disease numbers, rising incidence is really due to the epidemic or it's just to changes in testing. So there is a parallel question here. Is there better diagnosis? Is that also part of why we see more diseases? I think it has been the case in prostate cancer when the PSA came up. So how do you see that? And do you have that under control, this confounding factor?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, when I did the first set of modeling for the kind of risk map, which was used for USAID, we did think very carefully about how to control for effort. So effort and surveillance is a really big deal. And we tried to kind of use the amount of effort that had gone on into of research into diseases in that particular place to control for that. So I think that is a really big and important point. In the new Lassa models we've done for the NCDC in Nigeria, surveillance is a really critical part of the models. And we've interviewed the people that had set out the surveillance program so that we have a really good handle on the effort that went into the surveillance. So there was a huge outbreak in 2018 of Lassa Fever in Nigeria. And the question then was, had it gone human to human? Because if that happened, all hell would have broken loose. But I think what happened was that they were kind of on top of the surveillance. So it was better surveillance and a bit more of the rainfall in that year, that which kicked off into the rodent populations. And so there was a bit more, but it was mostly they were looking harder. So teasing out surveillance, I think, is really important when you're trying to do this, and it has to be part of the models. And I think some of these more like Bayesian approaches have got the capacity to put the observation metric in a really a really good way, which can control for the amount that you're looking. That was a long answer, sorry.
All right, thanks a lot. I'll read the next question. Has it been considered that a lack of biodiversity is representative of difficult conditions that can lead to stressed individuals that are more likely to carry a virus? So that's the link between loss of biodiversity and higher frequency of infectious diseases.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that they are more stressed as well. So that is definitely an aspect of that. But you have to be a certain type of species to be able to survive in those landscapes. You know, you have to be either a good disperser, you're a bird or you're a rat, so to get to another place, which is better, or have a wider home range so that it doesn't matter if one patch is poorer in resources, or you live faster and die younger and invest less in immunity. So I think that's kind of an open question actually about what is it about those species which is causing them to firstly survive in those landscapes, and then secondly, are they investing more in immunity, or are they super stressed and their immune systems have gone bonkers? So I think that's a really cool question. I think we need to understand that more, because that's key really to understanding why we're seeing these big patterns.
Thank you. Here is a question that arises due to all of our experience with the COVID pandemic. So we have seen these, you talk about predictions at the end of your talk, quantitative predictions of risk. And we have seen these predictions in the COVID epidemic. Virologists, epidemiologists telling us that we're before a big wave and all our hospitals will be full. And in the end, they weren't. And epidemiologists learned quickly that they talk about scenarios rather than predictions, because the human reaction is really intrinsically not modelable. That's what we're told. In the end, if the wave doesn't come, the reason is because we reacted to the predictions. So I didn't hear the difference between prediction and scenario in your context. So do you have that same problem? And if not, why not?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think the kind of scale that we're operating at is slightly different to the COVID predictions, which are kind of human to human, the far end of our kind of model, which is the human to human transmission part. And it's operating within, a country or a city. So I think that is, the scale is slightly different, I think, and people's reactions to the situation are going to be, important for that type of modeling. So I think that we're kind of operating at this kind of more large scale approach to understanding the really broad effects over longer periods of time. So that's a slight caveat, but I think that we would take the same approach to scenarios as well in our predictive modeling. But we kind of tend, in this approach, we've kind of tended to think about, okay, what's going to happen in 50 years, not next week, or what's going to happen in 5 months, not tomorrow or the next week. So I think it's a kind of slightly larger scale of predictions, and we've used scenarios. Or we're using scenarios to think about future land use change, like what's the pressure on, agriculture, what's the human growth patterns in that region, so are we going to see huge conversion, more of land? So I guess it's the same kind of approach, but I think we're at a different, we're less susceptible to some of those human changes. Short-term changes, we're more thinking about these big ecological processes. That sounds like a cop-out really, but it really wasn't supposed to be.
All right, thanks. I'll switch topic a bit. I think you made a connection between bats being good hosts of viruses and bats flying. And so here's a very simple question. Why not birds? Why bats?
Well, that's right. Why not birds? I think that's, so whoever asked that should go immediately to go and figure out why not birds. I think that's a brilliant question. It's a brilliant question. And why are bats getting the flack here? I think birds probably are the same. So okay, that's an excellent question. So 10 points to whoever asked that question.
Okay, I can't even tell you ask the question. Yeah. So let me see. There are only complicated question here, and here's a question that I wouldn't know how to answer. So let's see.
Oh no, don't ask me that one.
What can you do to prevent an outbreak once you know that it might occur in 3 months?
So that's a really good question. I think what we've been doing with the NCDC is putting out, you know, more health warnings for people, or targeting areas where we think these outbreaks would happen. So for Lassa fever, it goes through, the virus goes through urine and feces for contaminated food mostly. So it's about, you know, it's about public safety announcements, you know, health safety announcements. It's also targeting poorer communities and giving them, you know, plastic tubs to put their food in so that they don't get urine and feces on that. It's about, you know, sanitation information. So you can target areas which we think would be of particular interest. And I think there's still gaps in our knowledge about Lassa fever. I have a suspicion from some of the incidence data I've seen recently that it's much more prevalent than we think, and seroprevalence in human populations is enormous. So I think a lot of people have it, and I think it's a much more serious problem than we've possibly been made aware of. So I think you can also, so I think you can target intervention measures. And also there's talk of a Lassa vaccine as well at the moment. And I think that's it had some progress in getting a Lassa vaccine. It's not available at the moment, but I think there's some work underlying that. And that could be a way, our modeling could be a way of prompting the CDC to vaccinate in those particular areas, because you know that's going to happen.
All right. So here's another question, and that concerns the interaction between different infectious diseases. I want to just point you to a case, and that is that the distancing measures that we've had in order to prevent the COVID-19 pandemic, or not prevent, but get it under control, more or less, also prevented us from getting other respiratory diseases. Flu went down and RSV went down, and we are now seeing RSV coming up. RSV is a virus which is especially dangerous to small children. And since we've basically had a naive population, 1 year of no RSV, people are now concerned with children being at higher risk of being seriously impaired with RSV. So here is a clear interaction between two respiratory diseases. So do you have this in your radar, and are you looking at models that take that into account?
Yeah, I think that's a really area of research that we want to get into, is trying to figure out, not taking it from one disease at a time, but thinking about those interactions, and also in the hosts as well. So it could be that if they're infected by one virus, that another virus is not able to enter or you know, replicate so much. So actually, I think it's not just about humans; it's also about the hosts as well. So I think that's a really, I think it's very difficult to do that, but I think that would be a really interesting area to explore.
So in general, if you can compare yourself to the state of the art of modeling in epidemiology, you're not doing quite the same thing, although it's related. So how do you see yourself in lockstep, or is epidemiology further ahead? If so, how far?
So epidemiology is obviously just focused on mostly human of pathogen of infectious agents moving between human populations.
No zoonoses.
And a lot of people traditionally they have used compartmental models that I showed you briefly, compartmental models to do that, so that, you know, they typically use compartmental models like you are exposed, you are now infectious, you are now dead, or you're recovered. You know, they do that, and that's how they kind of use these kind of block models, mass action models to model diseases. And now more recently, they've been using point process models like agent-based models in order to model infectious agents going from person to person. And that's the kind of cutting edge of this. However, that's massively computationally difficult. And so the area that you can do that on is actually is small, is much smaller. It's at the city level or the country level, or the, you know, the local area level rather than a regional level. So I think there's some new kind of approaches which maybe can take some shortcuts in the point process in the point process modeling, so that you could start to think about using a point process model to model diseases at a really big scale. So perhaps we could start to use some of those models in this kind of landscape approach. But we've kind of done a bit of a trick, really. We've used a compartmental model within a grid. So we've got a kind of mass action model within a grid that's parameterized by what we know is on the ground at that particular grid. So the human population density, the suitability of the landscape for the host, some kind of spillover constant that we know from other studies, the vulnerability of the population, how poor they are, how much they move about. So we've kind of done a kind of mashup model, but I think there's a much more, you know, maybe there's a more integrated way that we could go forward on that. But I think what we've done is slightly different, because we've put this kind of zoonotic force of infection in our mass action models, which is new, I think, and linked it to the environment. I think that's the other thing.
Thank you. So I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Here's a very technical question, which I have to read. I guess it goes to the 2008 paper concerning the spatial spillover model from 2008. What are the reasons for the drastic differences in Central Europe, for instance, between German and French sites of the Upper Rhine Valley? Does that
my goodness. Wow, that's a very detailed question.
That tests your long-term memory.
That does test my long-term memory. Gosh, well, I can tell you what's in there. I've written it on the slide, which is on the slide. You know, you've got human population density, you've got the amount of biodiversity in that square, you've got latitude, rainfall, and what else did I put? Wildlife host richness. Yeah, and human population growth. So that's the model. So this is just, the map is just a reflection of that model. So if there's differences in those variables across the Rhine Valley, then that would explain why those are different. Okay.
So here's another provocative question. That will be my last question, and it allows for a quick answer.
Oh.
Where do you think does the spillover of SARS-CoV-2 come from?
Oh gosh. I'm afraid of getting firebombed. This audio won't firebomb me, will they?
You may decline the answer, but we were among us, you know.
Okay.
This is just
right. Well, I think there's a huge amount of conspiracy theories going around, which is just extraordinary. I mean, this is what I really think, right? So I think there was a huge amount of conspiracy theories going around about a lab leak. Is that what you're asking?
No, I thing that I find most promising is fur trade.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, the thing is, though, I've just told you about how environmental degradation impacts the species present and this human interface of, you know, land use degradation and the animals that change in those communities. So why do you want to invoke fur trade, the fur trade card? Can't you just say, look, there's a huge potential spillover environment here, like that area is huge numbers of people, it's degraded the landscape into agriculture. Well, not degraded, but it's changed it into agriculture. There's a huge, massive spillover interface there that's of high risk. So why do you have to think about fair trade? There's a massive interface already. There's billions of people, like millions of people who are in contact with bats.